I'm a psychopharmacologist, that is, I study the interaction of behaviorally active drugs and behavior. And I've been doing research preclinically and clinically for 40 years now at Hopkins. About 12 years ago, we initiated our studies, human studies with psilocybin. And that's been a really fascinating adventure to unfold.
At what moment on your research path did you realize there's something more to these experiences?
That mystical experience, although it sounds a little loosey-goosey, actually has been well defined by psychologists in the psychology of religion. And it is comprised of several features: a sense of the interconnectedness of all things, that's a unity; a sense of sacredness; a sense that the experience is more real and more true than everyday waking consciousness; a sense of open-heartedness, love, positive mood; transcendence of time and space; and finally, ineffability. People say, I can't possibly put this experience into words.
Was the spiritual component and meditation something you were being taught in medical school?
In terms of my own involvement with this research, about 17 years ago now, I initiated a regular meditation practice. And that really affected me very profoundly. It got me interested in the nature of spiritual transformation, the nature of spiritual experience. It got me reading comparative religious textbooks and diving into a literature that I actually had no business diving into as a psychopharmacologist. I do drug abuse pharmacology.
As a psychopharmacologist, how does that role play into this phenomena?
There was a curious period of time actually where I was really wondering, how was I to engage in psychopharmacology? Here I am, a drug abuse pharmacologist with an interest in core transformative experiences, until, of course, I became reacquainted with this older literature suggesting that these compounds might occasion experiences that looked like mystical type experiences.
I'm not crazy. Does this lead to something bigger?
What type of studies are you currently doing to learn more about this phenomena?
I had a grant to study comparative pharmacology of various sedative hypnotics. We initiated it in healthy volunteers. We constructed the study such that if it didn't show anything interesting about spirituality or mystical experience, I could still go ahead and publish it as an interesting comparative pharmacology study.
Talk to me about your findings from a scientific point of view.
So we think we have a biological model for tapping into these kinds of transformative experiences. And now, as a scientist, we can do prospective studies. In other words, we can do planned studies in which we can occasion these kinds of experiences and then study all kinds of things. So we can study reductionistically the neuroscience underpinnings of where in brain, what receptor systems, what neurotransmitter systems, what neural circuits are activated during experiences like this. We can study things like in biological psychiatry about how personality factors interact with these kinds of experiences, or how genetics interact with these kinds of experiences, or whether intention or expectation interacts with these experiences. This is a really interesting phenomena. We think it looks like we're tapping into a basic biology of the human condition in which these salient experiences of interconnectedness emerge. And if you really sit back and reflect on it in the kind of the history of humankind, those are the kinds of experiences that really form the bedrock foundation of most of the world's religions and the world's ethical and moral traditions.
Following these transformational experiences, the healthcare industry is now being trained to give support and be quiet and listen to these people and their stories when they come back.
people are reporting long-term changes, positive changes in attitudes, moods, and behaviors due to these experiences. So there's a sense of increased self-awareness, increased sense of personal integration. People feel less depressed or more buoyant moods. A lot of pro-social kinds of attitudinal changes. People feel more of service to others. They feel more loving, compassionate, attentive, and sensitive. Now, what's interesting about these experiences is that not only are they very salient and compelling at the time that they occur, but on follow-up, people attribute remarkable salience continue to attribute remarkable salience to the experience, and in fact, rate them as among the most personally meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives. So that's really quite a remarkable metric, and we've pushed people on what that means, and they might compare the meaningfulness of this experience to, say, a birth of a firstborn child or a death of a parent. But these are big experiences. We picked psilocybin to study because it is one of the classic serotonergically mediated hallucinogens that were thought to produce these kinds of effects. So, psilocybin, ayahuasca, which is made from DMT, and mescaline are all naturally occurring serotonergic compounds. Their pharmacology is all mediated through serotonin 2A receptors. LSD is a man-made classic hallucinogen, but it's also mediated through that same receptor population. So psychiatry, and now we're talking about what are the underpinnings of what creates different psychiatric phenomenology, if you will. And there are a bunch of questions that can be asked of that. So some are genetic questions, and there have been very interesting studies that have been conducted that show that aspects of the serotonin transporter system that is marked genetically, and you can take a blood sample and find out whether someone has what's called a polymorphism for certain receptors, that is, whether they have some kind of inherent biological sensitivity for some receptors over other receptors. And some of that work has shown that these genetic differences can account for differences in lifetime experience of the phenomena of transcendence. This has nothing to do with drugs. It's just that some polymorphisms, some genetic components, make people apparently more disposed to have experiences of the ineffable, if you will. And so it would be very interesting to know whether those kinds of biological determinants altered fundamentally the experience with psilocybin or these other classic hallucinogens. As well, there are setting conditions that can be studied to explore the nature of how much of these experiences are controlled by pharmacology versus personality versus expectations. So one study we would love to do is to compare people with vastly different spiritual orientations. Many of our studies to date have been done in a group of people who would consider themselves to be spiritually interested or spiritually awake, insofar as they're curious about matters of spirituality. They might participate in meditation or prayer practice, or at least read about those kinds of things. And those people would contrast, of course, with declared atheists, who subscribe to a total material world frame and don't have any room in their cognitive thought system, for some of these other, kinds of thoughts or way of thinking. And so it'd be very interesting to study and compare those two groups to see what happens under those conditions and how people interpret those experiences, and whether you can change someone who has an agnostic or atheist orientation to something that looks more spiritual or not. It could be that you don't, but yet it could be that those experiences still have all the embedded personal meaning and salience. It may very well boil down to a difference in language. This word spiritual is really loose. And if you if you read Einstein, or if you listen carefully to Dawkins, who's an avowed atheist, he'll talk about the mystery and the majesty of the universe and the mystery and the majesty of the biological process that's creating evolution. And if you listen to him, that it would be easy for someone else who isn't a self-identified atheist, much less an icon of that, to say, yeah, I believe that too, and I think that's spiritual. Because we're talking about the mystery, right, of human existence, the core question about what we're doing here, what all this means. How do we explain the fact that we find ourselves awake in this sea of consciousness, in these bodies that can interact in the world, and that at least strikes me as being pretty phenomenal and pretty mysterious, whether you want to call it spiritual or not. So, at one level, it sounds like we know a lot, and there are very interesting models about, furthermore, how perceptual processes may be altered through gating mechanisms from reticular activating system up to cortex. And so we have model systems that are beginning to explain what's going on. But I would have to submit that right now, as neuroscience, that we need to be really humble about claiming we really know much of anything. I mean, we don't have a solid hypothesis for why we're conscious, and so these are just very, very crude approximations to providing neuroscience explanations for what's going on. One thing I should say, just that I haven't said, is that everything is not love and light with these psilocybin experiences. And although we have shown 60 to 70% of people have full mystical experiences, we've also shown that about 30% of people have experiences of very significant fear, anxiety, or even terror during these experiences. Now, very often those experiences, these negatively valenced experiences, are short-lived, but not always. And they can be very uncomfortable experiences. As a matter of fact, among the most uncomfortable experiences that people have ever had psychologically in their lives. I think I want to underscore that because it says something important. We have volunteers who are carefully selected, carefully prepared, and they're carefully monitored, and yet we have a 30% rate of these potentially difficult experiences. It's not hard to imagine that administration of these compounds under unsupervised conditions could lead to people to engaging in panic reactions or fearful reactions in which they could put themselves or others in harm's way. You know, there are, like it or not, there are repeated reports of people engaging in catastrophic behaviors, jumping out of windows, jumping off of cliffs, running into traffic. And it looks like a lot of that is due simply to a terror response. And so there's that risk associated with these compounds. And then there's another risk that we try to protect against in screening people, and that is that there is this concern that people who are psychiatrically vulnerable, people who might be disposed towards psychotic process, might just be pushed over the edge with an experience of this sort. There's no hard data to support that, but there are case reports suggesting that that could be a possibility. Within the context in which we do research, we need to be ultra cautious. We're in a major medical school. We eliminate anyone with first or second degree relatives with psychotic process. We eliminate people who have borderline personalities or who really appear psychiatrically vulnerable. And so, you know, there are risks associated with using these compounds. And so what I don't want my message to be that there are none. I think there needs to be a boatload of wisdom and context that goes into conditions that support the administration of these compounds.